So actually today is a very rough day for me. It's the 29th anniversary of the bombing of the Ahavah Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires. And that was the largest attack against the Jewish community in the exile since the Shoah. And to this date, no serious arrest has been made. It is really a classic cover-up. And I was just on a Zoom with Argentinian rabbinic colleagues, and there were a few of us trying to remember. And the custom that they have, and I've been there, is they call off the names, and after every name, everyone responds presente. That is, that the person who has died is still metaphysically still present. So it was quite moving. And today, complicated day in Israel too, because a lot of the train stations and the airports are being closed down. I actually wanted to see this kind of rally. And Saturday night I went because we were in Tel Aviv for Shabbat. And I think my emotions then, I had two emotions. One, it was exhilarating to see people on the left, especially children, caring enough to protest. For a long time, I got a sense they weren't caring. On the other hand, it was very painful. There were thousands of kids. And I know that there are thousands of kids who disagree with them so strongly. And the country is divided and needs someone to bring these sides together. And Herzog is, of course, in the White House. I don't know if you've heard. Netanyahu he got an invitation, not to the White House, though. So maybe they'll meet in Central Park. I don't know. But the whole thing is just so politically out of control. So I want to share with you just a piece from the Talmud, which deals with these days, the days which are right before the fast of Av, when we remember the temples destroyed. And there is a long Talmudic piece, which actually was on the daf, on the folio that we learn every day. And it's the story of what occurred, what inspired's not the right word, what brought about the destruction of the temple. It's my opinion that we don't fast for events of the past. The past has already happened. We fast to consider why something in the past happened and do our best to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes so that it not happen again. And so before the second temple was destroyed, the temple was destroyed in the year 68 or 70. And before it was destroyed, the city was surrounded and no food was allowed in or out. And there was a great rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And he was a person who very much wanted to negotiate with the Romans. But in the city at that time, there was a very significant group, not that many, but significant, and they were called the Biryoni. The best way I can describe the Biryoni is that they were the then JDL. You had a Kahana, a Rabbi Kahana kind of group, and they were considered extremist. And they argued, we can't talk to the Romans, we just can't. So according to the Talmud, page 56a in Gittin, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai happened to have been the head of the Biryoni's uncle. So speaking to his nephew, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says to the Biryonim, the head of the JDL, what are you doing? They're going to starve us to death. What do you propose? His nephew said. He said, find a way to get me out of this siege. He says, how can we? The Romans have closed off the city. He said, look, here's what you should do. Let me feign death. I will make believe that I'm dead and you'll put me in a coffin. Now, it's not well known, but there really basically is no Jewish cemetery in Jerusalem. In most cities, there are cemeteries in the middle of the city. In Jerusalem, the cemeteries are by and large on the outskirts, in Bet Shemesh, the Eretz HaChaim, in Har HaMenuchot, in the cemetery, the famous one, the Har HaZeitim, the Mount of Olives. So he said, you'll feign death and you've got to take me out to be buried. There's nowhere in Jerusalem to be buried. And he said, okay. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai puts himself into a coffin. And as the coffin is being taken out, the Romans at the borders say, and he was being carried out by his family, by his nephew, the head of the extremists. So the Romans said, we're not so sure that this rabbi is really dead. So I'm going to take a spear and I'm going to puncture this coffin and I'm going to drive the spear through the coffin. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai came to the defense of his uncle and said, you can't do that. Even though you're Romans, you're not going to want that people will say that you defiled the great rabbi. Somehow they got Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai out. And now I'm picking up the Gemara, I'll translate. Kimata lahat. When Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai came out, he came to Vespasian, who was not the emperor. He came to Vespasian, who was very high in the command, in the pecking order. Omar, and Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai, who's the lead rabbi, he says, Shlama olecha malka, Shlama olecha malka. Peace be unto you, O king, O emperor. Peace be unto you, O emperor. That's what he said. That was his opening words. You wonder, what do you say when you're in front of the president of the United States? What will Herzog say? Is he going to be working with Netanyahu? Do they have a commonality of agenda? Are they going to be working and one is going to be put, again, opposite the other? One is a good guy, one is a bad guy. How exactly will that proceed? But Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai's first words was one of peace. Greetings to you, O emperor. Amalei, the emperor responded, you know, your words are so biting. They're so discourteous. I will kill you twice. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, I meant it well. What did I say that was wrong? He says, Mechayaft trei kitala. You are guilty of two capital offenses. Chada, the first is delav malka ana. The first is I'm not the emperor. And if you called me the emperor, you were just mocking me. You were making fun of me. You can't make fun of me. That is a capital offense. I'm not the king, the kokoret li malka. You called me king. The two, and secondly, malka anan, he says, if I am the emperor, ad ha'idno amaylo otit ligabai. If I am the emperor, how come you waited so long to come to me? Why didn't you come before? So in this simple conversation back and forth, there's a lot of tension. He wants to negotiate some kind of peace with this Roman leader, calling him Malka, Melech, king, the emperor, the top person. And he says, I'm upset with you to the point I should kill you twice. Twice, not once, twice. I'm not the king. You're making fun of me. And number two, if I was the king, how come you didn't come to me before him? Just as anecdotally, when I served as Jonathan Pollard's rabbi for those 10 years, I was very close to Jonathan's father, Morris. And at that time, Morris was close to Jonathan. In the end, they unfortunately parted from each other before Morris died. And I once said to Morris, who was a very prominent scientist working as a professor at the University of Notre Dame, he tried to really help his son. I said, Morris, did you ever speak to Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, who really was responsible for Pollard's sentence? Did you ever talk to him? After all, Morris was a person who was part of the military in his day. Maybe they could speak the same language. He said, yes, I did speak to him. I said, what happened in the conversation? Morris said to me that he said to Weinberger, my son never went to trial. It was a plea agreement. How does he get a plea agreement? And he's sentenced to life. If you make a plea agreement, you don't get sentenced to life. You get a couple of years. That's what he said to Weinberger. And Weinberger responded to Morris. He said, what your son did was so terrible, he deserved to be put to death. And they continued talking, and Morris is aghast. He deserves to be put to death. And again, Weinberger said, Jonathan Pollard deserved to be put to death. And Morris said to me, he said to Weinberger, Mr. Secretary of Defense, you want to kill him a second time? You can only kill him once. How many times do you want to kill him? This was his way of saying that he was full of animus. Just this story reminds me of that story where the emperor says, I should be killing you twice. Now we're skipping over a couple of lines, and suddenly this is what happens. Ad dahochi, as they were conversing, Ati priskta alaimi Romi, a messenger came from Rome to Israel. Amale kum, he says to Vespasian, that is the leader whom Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was talking to, the one whom Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai called king erroneously. So the messenger says to him, Kim, rise, the mitli Caesar, the Caesar has died. The Amre Hanu Chashiva de Romi Lotivach Beresha. And in Rome, the big machers have decided that you're going to be the emperor. And according to the Talmudic narrative, this happens right after Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai called him the emperor, and he was upset. And at that instant, the messenger comes and says, you're the man, you're the emperor. And to make a long story short, so Vespasian was very, very taken by this, very taken by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Maybe he thought he had some kind of mystical abilities. His mind was unbelievable. He called him emperor. No one knew at that point he was the emperor, and it so was that he actually had just been appointed emperor. So the Vespasian says, I have to return to Rome right away because I'm the emperor. He says, Mizela Zilna, I've got to go back. Somebody else is going to take my place. But then he says, before I go back, Elaboi minoi midi, ask of me anything that atan lach, that I should give you. You are obviously a very special individual. I know Rome and the Israelites are at odds, but there's something about you. You knew I was emperor before it was announced. And even though I was upset with you, obviously you're on another level. Before I go back, I want to pay you back. Ask for whatever you want, and I'll give it to you. And Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai, it's right here on page 56b, turns to Vespasian and he says 4 words: Tain li Yavne v'chachameha. Give me Yavne. What is Yavne? Yavne was a seat of study near the Mediterranean, in the middle of Israel, not far from the second port called Ashdod in modern times. Give me Yavne and its sages. In other words, he was saying, at least, given the difficult situation we're under, I know Jerusalem is lost. It's been surrounded. There's no hope for Jerusalem. Okay, I'm not asking you for Jerusalem, but at least give me Yavne. And when Rabbi Akiva heard about this incident, that the emperor Vespasian had told Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai, you can ask for whatever you want. And he asked for Yavne. He asked for that little Torah enclave, but he did not ask for Jerusalem. Rabbi Akiva quoted the sentence, Meshiv chachamim achor, even rabbis, sages could be fools. And he confronts Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and he said, you can have what you want. Why didn't you ask for Jerusalem? And he responded, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did, I was afraid that if I would make that big ask, afilu purta namilo, if I would make that big ask, he would reject it out of hand, and I wouldn't even get Yavne. So recognizing I couldn't get Jerusalem, I asked for Yavne. And from this give and take, there has emerged what can be called a whole theology, differences on how Jews should politic, should negotiate with Gentiles. There are those, like myself for many years, who insisted Rabbi Akiva was right. Activist or maximalist, he says you can ask for what you wanted. Ask for Jerusalem. Why are you compromising? And there are others who said, no, Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai did something very smart. Had he asked for the maximum, he would have gotten nothing. At least that way, he saved Yavne. He saved a seat of study. Now, I want to add one more point. The destruction of the temple, which we're commemorating in a week, was a sad moment. But in every negative, there's always slivers of positive. Even in the destruction of the temple, there was a positive. And I'll tell you what the positive was. While the temple was in existence, all of Judaism was unifocused. All roads of Judaism led to Jerusalem. All roads led to the temple. It was very Jerusalem-centered. That's where it was. Once Jerusalem was destroyed, there suddenly there was birthed first a Torah center in Yavne, and in time there were Jewish centers all over the world, in Europe, in North Africa, and many of these places of Jewish habitation where there were large Jewish communities had all kinds of cultural centers and religious centers, including Torah centers. And one wonders, what is the better model? Is the better model that there should be primarily one Torah center in Jerusalem? Or are we better off with numerous, a whole multiplicity of Torah centers all over the world? So the position of Rabbi Akiva that you should have asked for Jerusalem, as opposed to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's position that let me begin with the Torah center in Yavne, and that brought about so many other Torah centers, is a very, very deep debate. And so I want to stop here and ask you, which position do you think was correct? Was Rabbi Akiva correct? That Yochanan ben Zakkai, how dare he forsake Jerusalem? He was forsaking Jerusalem. Or was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai correct? I can't get Jerusalem. The Romans were intent on destroying Jerusalem. At least let me save Yavne. Let me save Yavne, and with that will be born that idea that there could be Torah centers, or if one is not into Torah, other Jewish type centers throughout the world. Let me stop here and get your thoughts, and then I'll make one more comment on this. It's a fascinating story. Yes, Estelle.
Estelle, you're muted. You're muted.
I have a question on that. For instance, had Yochanan ben Zakkai said only in Jerusalem, and say, had he gotten it, because we never know, would that have given rise to the fact that all the other religions also focused on Jerusalem? And is that a good thing, or is it a bad thing? Because if it was always remained that only Judaism was focused on Jerusalem, then the others might not have also focused on it. We wouldn't have the problem today with the Arabs and Christians focusing on that also, that Jerusalem would always be only Jewish.
I see.
It's a question.
Yeah. So what you're saying, Estelle, is an added point that had he focused on Jerusalem, maybe then it would have been understood that it's a Jewish center and a Jewish center alone. That's what you're saying.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. We wouldn't have all the other problems.
Maybe. Anybody else have any thoughts?
I see Henry's hand. I think I saw Vivian's hand. Is that correct, Vivian? And I see Arnie's hand.
I don't see Henry.
Henry?
I see Hanoch.
Hanoch, sorry, yes. So Henry, you are muted. If you can unmute yourself, and then
if the Jews were already defeated and the Romans allowed them to have Yerushalayim, they still would be under Roman control. So there would be Torah just in Jerusalem, but if they went to Yavne, Torah would spread as it did. So I would say that I would lean with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that to ask for Yavne.
Right.
Well,
I hear you.
that's second rate.
Estelle, we're having here the classic battle between the Irgun and Sternist and the Palmach. The Irgunist and Sternist, they were Rabbi Akiva maximalists. They refused to negotiate. They were going to fight to the hilt. And then there were others who were strong fighters.
Who gave up the ghost.
They were, not that they weren't fighters, but they were more moderate about it. It's a fascinating Talmudic narrative. It's must learning. Thank you, Hanoch.
next we have Vivian, who is also muted.
Yeah, I just unmuted myself. I want to give my next comment in the name of Rabbi Kimmelman, whom I heard it from, and I thought it was very apropos that he said that at this point, since Jerusalem was no longer available to the Jews and the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, then Judaism had to change. Instead of being centered on sacrifices and Beis Hamikdash, it had to be based on Torah learning. And that's something that was portable. It could be brought to any country of the world. And it was brought to many different countries all over. And people began to study Torah as the basis of Judaism. And I think that made a big difference and allowed Judaism to survive over thousands of years up to the present time where we still are studying Torah.
That's very well said. And I know that Reuven, whom I have a nice relationship with, he was the scholar in residence in the JCC on the Palisades that
That's right.
you ran that program with.
Yes,
Rabbi
I did.
Herman, by Daniel
Yes.
Hartman and
Yeah,
Rabbi.
but,
No, that's very
Wow.
well said. Yep, that
yeah.
is a strong position. But it comes. I wanted to add, just for your consideration, in the end, there was a big debate whether the Jews in Jerusalem should rebel against Rome, separate from this whole story. And the person who led the rebellion was Rabbi Akiva.
Mhm.
He became an extremist, and he thought that Bar Kokhba was
Yeah.
the Messiah. And they fought against Rome. They said, their thinking was, what do you mean Jerusalem is not available to us? We're gonna fight to the end, and we're gonna make sure that we're gonna hold on to Jerusalem.
Mhm.
And as it turns out, as you know, Jerusalem fell. Rabbi Akiva was wrong. It sounds like Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai was vindicated on some level. It's my theory that because of that event, for the next 2,000 years, where we had no sovereignty, no autonomy, Jews, no matter where we lived, by and large, never wanted to adopt the policy of Rabbi Akiva, because that policy didn't work. The Romans destroyed us. And so they negotiated in the spirit of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And by and large, during those 2,000 years, Jews, we were not fighters. And to those who ask, how come there wasn't enough Jewish resistance during the Shoah? There was some, but why wasn't there enough? Although, let no one say, that no one may come to conclusions not having been there. When you're there and you're at the end of a Nazi gun, the bravest of us, who knows what they would have done. Who knows? But the Jews, for 2,000 years, they weren't fighters. And so they didn't fight. And by and large, there were pockets of resistance, the partisans, there were those who spiritually resisted, but we didn't know from fighting. What did we know from fighting? Estelle, we had a few fighters, Chana Senesh and others, but by and large, the community, that was not our way. And by the way, to take it a step further, Israel is born. And now when Israel is born, the question is, does the pendulum move to the opposite extreme from the Jewish people having no military might, not exercising power, to the other end where the Jews said, we're not going to make this mistake again of being powerless. We are going to have power. And of course, the challenge in Israel is when you have power, and I think Israel has been better at this than any country in the world. I put it out there that Israel has carried itself with what can be called an ethics of power, I don't believe that there's a country in the world surrounded by the enemies, the likes of Israel has around it, Hezbollah and Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Iran and the whole deal, that has conducted itself more ethically with all of the aberrations. Israel has done well. But that's the movement. The movement was from that moment where Rabbi Akiva lost, we became Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's. And then during the Shoah, it didn't work to our benefit. And therefore, when Israel is born, we go to the opposite extreme. And the challenge is, it's much easier to be ethical when you're powerless, much easier. But to be ethical when you're powerful, that's not safe. That is difficult. One last point. The Talmud tells us in Brachot on page 28b that Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai was on his death and he was crying. And they asked him, "Why are you crying?" And he said, "Because as I am taking my last breath, I'm still wondering, going back many years, whether I made the right decision." Whoa. Sometimes in life, you've got to make a decision, live with it, and move on. But he was a person of such emotional, spiritual depth. He wondered to his last breath. He said, "I see two roads before me. One takes me to heaven, the other one the other way. I don't know where they're going to take me. I don't know if I made the right decision." It's complicated. When I was a young activist, as I mentioned, I was a very big Rabbi Akivanik. I was. Now I'm beginning to see the side of Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai, and I think the two have to balance each other and live in dialectic. We've got to be strong. If you're not strong, certainly in the Middle East, you're going to be gobbled up. But it's got to be a strength with a powerful sense of musar, of ethics, which is the challenge Israel faces. And, I guess I have no objectivity because I so love Israel. I think Israel has done, considering the challenges, has done very, very well. A few more comments and we'll call it a
We have Arnie next, and then Lance, and then Ruby.
Okay.
So I have a couple of quick things to say. One, back in the time of the temple, most Jews lived in Israel.
Yes.
So it made sense to pull them in to the temple from the furthest reaches in Israel were not that far away. So it was a unifying actor in the country and in the polity of the Jews. So that was a good thing. But as Jews began settling in other places, which I think was happening around the time of the destruction, there were Jews living in Italy, there were Jews living in Babylonia. It was, I think, at that point, good to spread out, to have a model that would bring Jews living out, a Jew living in Rome would not be able to get to the temple for a holiday.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm making a geographic point, and
Yeah.
that's one thing. And like you said at the end, there's a mixture of good and bad in both choices, and the best model is them working together. And in Israel right now, this would have been unthinkable 10, 20, 30 years ago in the statehood. But they now have peace accords with so many Arab countries.
Yes,
It's a wonderful thing, and it's often glossed over by the press or by
great.
individuals. And here we are making peace with Morocco. I mean, who would have thought that 20 years ago?
The Saudis may be around the corner.
What's that?
The Saudis may be around the corner. Who knows?
Yeah, if they get enough trinkets from Biden.
As my father would say, a neue Welt, a new world.
Yeah. And then the last thing, your point about how we became Yochanan ben Zakkai Jews is true, but there's another effect, as there could be many effects. I think that the Jews, even though they built Israel according to certain ideals, I think Jews were not really prepared for statehood and for power. And I guess the best example that I can think of, I think it was Dayan, who signed the paper giving Judea and Samaria back to the Arabs a few days after the 6-day war.
Yeah.
What a mistake. What other
Yeah.
what other country would have done that?
Right.
But
Yep.
he need to.
Well said, Arnie. Well said.
Should I say something?
We have Lance and then Ruby and then Stuart if there's time.
Those are my.
Yes. Okay, I want to say something. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so Lance, Ruby, and then Stuart if there's time.
Okay. Israeli historian Gedali Alon contends that the story in the Talmud is pure fiction. It is highly unlikely that any leader in the ancient world would even talk to foreigners. Sammy Davis Jr. goes to Archie Bunker's home. The Karaites have a cemetery in Jerusalem, but the Karaites are not considered Jews, even though Egyptians consider Karaites Jews and persecute Karaites as Jews. It is unlikely that Rome burned. Rome's only revolts were 3 slave revolts. I suspect we cannot prove that the temple destroyed was the temple of the Samaritans. For me, Jesus was the high priest of the Samaritans. The Samaritans, Ethiopian Kesach, and Nigerian Igbo are all Kahanic religions, fully Jewish, that the rabbis, who in my view are Jewish anti-Semites, reject as Jews. And Mossad contends that the Jews in Buenos Aires were killed by agents of Iran. Thank you.
There's no doubt about that. That last point, no doubt about it.
Mhm.
Just, I still haven't gotten over that. I became so close with many of the Argentinian families, and just really, really sad. Thank you, Lance.
So we have Ruby and then Stuart.
Okay, looking at the past, there was increasing migration of peoples, and we can assume that Jews also migrated. If there were no other centers, there's a very strong possibility, I think, that we would have lost many of our people. And so it was a necessity to have other centers, let's say, world centers other than Yerushalayim, just because of the way that of the history of people and their movements.
Yes, and Ruby, there's a lot of discussion about if Iran, they talk about Israel as a one-bomb state. God forbid. That is to say that the state is so small that, God forbid, one nuclear weapon that hits, that could create who knows what. So there you hear these arguments that if all Jews in Israel, we would be more vulnerable. But of course, there are counter arguments that it's only because we're in Israel that we have an army that we're more protected. That's why these issues are really important, powerful issues that are discussed back and forth, and no one quite knows what's absolutely right. That's for sure.
Do we have a
Sure.
minute for Stuart to say something before I know, Rabbi, I know you need to end a little early.
I do,
Do we have a minute
yes.
for Stuart?
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah.
You know the word Bishet. Bishet is because we're performing a miracle. When the general, when Yochanan ben Zakkai spoke to the general, leading general of the Romans, when he got to see the general, he said, I'll make, can I make a deal? He knew the Jews couldn't defend themselves so well. Let me have a little place called Yabna, yeah, and it'll be all right, you know. And all of a sudden, those news came from Rome. That general became the that general became the head of the Roman Rome, and the Roman, he was so happy that he allowed it. It's Bishet. I'll give you another example of Bishet. Yesterday, I spoke with somebody. I'm not going to say whose names it was, but anyway, I suggested maybe you can't afford this college. Maybe you can go to a certain college, Lehman College. So you go, it's not so expensive. Because back in the old days, Lehman College and all those colleges were free. Now it's not so expensive, but it still costs money. All of a sudden, a lady comes. Her name is Ruthie, right? Lady comes. I told you Ruthie, and she says, "My son is a teacher of math, is a professor of math in Lehman." And she said, Ruth said, "Oh, my daughter is very good at math." It's Bishet. She came out of nowhere, and I was just talking about it. That's what thing called Bishet. In other words, the Roman general became the leader of Rome. And he was so happy that a few seconds after he spoke to Rabbi Ben Zakkai, right? He granted him, as if Hashem had done it somehow, magic thing. And as soon as he saw
Right. Thank you.
The whole thing is Bishet. Hashem is in charge of Bishet. You know,
Right.
I want to tell you another story. One more thing.
Right.
I was going to shul, Rabbi Stevens' classes. I collapsed 2 blocks away from the shul. A lady, it wasn't Jewish, she picked me up. She was in my building. She picked me up and she drove me to 2 blocks. In 2 blocks, I know you have to do that, but you have to walk. You don't have to do it. It's not rabbinic. It's a lock in the rabbinic. And she told me from that if I would have collapsed 2 blocks away from the shul, right, the Rabbi Parsha class, I would have. These are Bishet things. You know, those are Bishet. God, she happened to be there. I know you have to walk,
Right.
but you would have collapsed. All these are Bishet things.
Like Zalman, you have to take care of yourself. Be very careful when you're walking and try
that happened 6 years
try
ago.
not to fall.
That time on, I'll meet God halfway and meet God over. But I know,
Okay.
and now she's the lady is sick, and because the lady is sick, and because she knew my
Right.
age is helping her. So it all
yes.
revolves around this share thing. That's the most important thing. You know the story about Yochanan ben Zakkai.
Right. Zalman, I'm going to call you later and we'll talk, okay? One-on-one. I'm looking forward to that, Zalman. Zalman?
I help to let you be able to speak.
Okay.
I go every Friday night. My father died in Tisha
I
B'Av.
know.
I go every Friday night. And you know what?
Zalman's a
I was
Gaval.
very angry when my father died in Tisha B'Av.
Yes.
And my supervisor came from Netanya. He says, God wants you to go back. And from that time on, that's the whole story. That's all. That's
Right.
I went back. Okay, you get
Good.
it? It's
Good
all
for you, Zalman.
God's hand. Okay, thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Zalman. So next week we're going to take a break, and then the following Tuesday we'll pick it up, and I'm looking forward. And it's just
all
wonderful to
Bishet.
see. And it's all right? It's just wonderful to see all of you. Estelle, you have your hand on your head. Are you okay? You have
You're muted,
you're
Estelle. Sorry.
No, I'm fine, thank you.
good. That's good.
Did you manage to speak to the head of the Mitzudat Zev, the Bet Sefer, the Jabotinsky Museum?
No, it's
Eilat.
on my agenda. I became very involved this past month. I actually finished the commentary on the Haggadah of Passover, and I wanted to come out by this Passover, and also the 5 books are coming out now because they told me that it's ready. Shuli's watching that, and I can't wait to give you a copy, Estelle, and everyone a signed
Thank you,
copy.
but it's more important that you speak to the head of the Mitzudat.
Yeah,
That's very important.
yeah. Just sending you all my love, everybody. Take care of yourselves, and please be careful. Chanoch, be careful. No one should fall. Everybody should be careful. Love you.
Love you.